first presentation is Ms. Marisa Miakonda Cummings from the University of South Dakota. She's the Director of Student Services. Marisa.
Morning. Najwyżej wygląda mohaj żadnej wizyty jak Good morning to each and every one of you. Thank you for getting up early and being here today. When I just introduced myself, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to take a little shift here from just strategies. And because you are all in Waha that I'm here right now, I'd like to talk about some ideas of how we recognize our authentic selves and how that plays into higher education. And so when we talk about our authentic selves, sometimes there's this idea that we have to give that up in order to be educated, or that to be educated, or what we call educated, is to be white, right? And I want to talk about how we can use that education to maintain and actually build nations and build our communities and our culture. So when we talk about our authentic selves, and I introduce myself in Umaha, and I know that many of you have heard these introductions before, we identify ourselves as our Umaha name, right? Because that name is who you are. That's your authentic self, right? Your clanship, that is your obligations, your duties to your community. And then I come from the Ishasu, the sky realm, the sky people and the earth people, right? So within that sky realm, there's also duties and obligations that we have to one another. So our hulaga, or our clanship system, teaches us our relationship to one another. It teaches us our duties and responsibilities to creation itself, right? And that's who we are. That's our first authentic being, our authentic self. In addition to that, we have other obligations. For me, I'm the firstborn child, I'm the firstborn daughter, and I'm the first grandchild in my family. So my grandmother and I have a very close relationship. Growing up, she would always say, "You're mine." And I didn't really understand what that meant until I got a lot older, and I would, I'm like, why does grandma say that all the time? Why does she say you're mine? And my grandmother and I, when I knew like real unconditional love, that comes from my grandmother. I knew that first from my grandmother. She would have like a little table for me when I went to her house, and little dishes and little bitty silver spoon and fork that was always set aside for me. And her love for me, just it extends to this day. She's 85 years old, almost 86. And she's the reason I moved back home. She has end-stage COPD. And so not only is it my cultural obligation as a firstborn daughter and firstborn grandchild to care for her, but it's my duty, and I love that that's my obligation. I love it very much. So that's a big part of who I am, right? And we also know that those cultural teachings are passed down from the grandparents to the oldest grandchild. And the reason for that is the oldest grandchild can teach the younger ones, right? So there was a thought process, there was a strategy, there was critical thinking that went behind that cultural tradition. In addition to that, I'm a mother. I have 4 kids. I have a companion, and I'm also a member of the Grand Medicine Lodge in Medina. And that's a big part of my work that I do, and trying to into spiritualness as well. So then we have the majority culture way of introducing ourselves, right? So a lot of times that's our English names, and it goes along with an education or your job. You know, so people I notice in European American settings, people say, "What do you do?" That's one of the first questions. What do you do? And that defines kind of who someone is by the job that they do. And so as far as that goes, I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa in American Studies. And my area of research was actually on maroon colonies of resistance, native forms of resistance to colonial oppression. I have a minor in American Indian Native Studies, and I'm working on my master's degree right now in tribal administration and governance, which is kind of like a nation building program at the University of Minnesota group. I worked in higher education for 13 years, and I'll talk a little bit about how that came about. So this is kind of my family, and I think about how we are as Indigenous people, and we see a lot of things visually, so I wanted to be able to explain this. So this first picture up here, you see, this is my great-great-great-grandfather. His name was Wahamide, or Orphan, and his English name was Alan Walker. And he was part of what they call the Council Fire at that time, which was 13 families that were resisting colonial oppression. And they fought until the very end, until they were rounded up and literally forced onto their lots. And so what you're seeing here in this picture is a treaty signing. And if you see him, and then you see this man over here, he's a case away, and my great-great-great-grandfather was attending. And what you see is these two men didn't sign that treaty. These men over here signed it in their place. And so that's my family history. That's part of who I am. And we don't hear that history, right? We don't hear that. We don't hear this told about this picture, and I know this picture is at your college, and then you see this picture every day. And so this is what the history I've been told about my family. And so this is who I come from. You see he's dressed, and representing himself. So then his son was Horace Walker. He's not in this picture. And then Horace Walker's son was Charles Walker, who you see here in Nebraska. And he was married to my great-grandmother. Her name was Ida Walker. And she was what we call Dakota. She had the mark of honor. And that's why she's wearing, right now, you see her wearing that cloth on her head. And the reason she wore that was so that the DIA agents wouldn't know that she was marked. When they found out she was marked, rations were called from the family. And she passed away when my grandma was 10 years old. And so my grandpa Charlie ended up remarrying another lady. But there were 5 children that they had together, and my grandmother was one of them. My grandpa Charlie was the first Carpenter, according to the Indian Reorganization Act, Constitution that we could given. And so you see him here in this picture. He's the second to the right, and he's there with a congregation of leaders from Nebraska, Ponca, Santee, and they went to DC to try and petition President Truman not to terminate the So this was an era, a very scary era, and these men rode railroads. They rode in the cattle cartridges, the cattle railroad cars up to DC, all the way to DC to do that. So these weren't men that had a lot of wealth. They weren't men that drove cars or planes. But their intention was to make sure that they took care of their people, and they did that. So my grandpa Charlie, in terms of education, he was sent to Carlisle. So what happened a lot of times is that the DIA would target hereditary chief lines, and they would take those sons to Carlisle. And so my grandpa Charlie was taken to Carlisle when he was in about 5th grade, and he was taken with his brother Fred. And there's now documents online. If you've all looked at Carlisle, you can access all the documents online. And so they graduated from Carlisle, and he then came home and took on the position as chairman. So my grandmother, I explained how her mother passed away when she was 10 years old. As soon as they day school, then it was day school. So we went to school up until 8th grade, and most people stopped at 8th grade in this time. But my grandmother was sent out to Haskell, which was then boarding school. It's not the Haskell we know today. And while she was there, all she knew was language. She's a first language speaker. She knew her family, and she was without all of that. And so she said, I thought I did something wrong, and that's why they sent me away. That's what she tells me. And she said, now I know that's not what happened, but they wanted something better for me. But back then, at 14 years old, she brought up herself down there. My grandmother became the first Omaha Haskell queen. So you see the picture of her up there. So she was very well liked. But she talks about how poor they were, and how she, at one time, her father tried to send her clothes, and he actually sent her maternity clothes because he was trying to send her something. So she had to work while she was at hospital too in order to provide for herself and for basic needs. So I think a lot of my grandmother, I really love her a lot. So here's a picture of, this is my grandmother and then her sister, my other grandma. And my grandmother, she's the last one, so all of her siblings have passed away, and she's still here with us. And then my father is, my father's father, we never knew. We know who he is, but we never had a relationship with him. And so my father was raised by my grandmother's brothers and my great-grandpa Charlie. And he was given the name Elimination. And what that name means, it's a really beautiful name. So when the buffalo come out, and that first buffalo is coming out, and it's a stampede, and the whole earth is just shaking. And then at the same time, it's thundering and lightning all around. So that combines the buffalo people with the sky people, so that connects that. So it's a really beautiful name. And my father and I were very, very close. He's no longer with us. He passed away in 2005. He had a really hard upbringing. They were very, very poor. A a lot of times there was multiple people in the home growing up, as we all know how that works, especially because they lived in Sioux City, so when everyone would come to the city to work, they lived in a house with him. He had a brother and a sister that were both adopted out, that we know them now, but that was part of his life journey, was finding them and reuniting with them, because ICWA didn't exist back then. So my father earned his bachelor's degree from Marisas College in Sioux City while he was lifting beef at IDP. So he worked very, very hard. He has an incredible work ethic, and I really value that. So here you see him, 4 years old, and my father's graduated from Marisas College. So he was first generation in our family to graduate. My dad also was really engaged in the 90s. We went through this cultural renaissance among the Mohawks, and you probably don't remember that. We went through a really amazing renaissance. We were looking at our cultural ways. We were having people that were highly educated that were coming back home, and he was part of that. So after he received his master's degree from Iowa State University, he moved back home. He worked for IDP in corporate office, and then he worked for Gateway Computers in the corporate office as a public relations specialist. And then he went, when the tribe decided to open the casino up, after the long legal battle, he worked as GM for the casino. So you see him here at the casino. And the casino was highly profitable at that time. And then the last picture you see here is actually a 5-generation picture. This is one of my grandmas. Her name is Edith Walker Springer. And Grandma Edith is the one who named me when I was born, and she gave me her name. And so here we have, she was the sister to my grandpa Charlie. And then we have my grandmother, my dad, myself, and my firstborn daughter in the room. So that's a little bit about where I come from and how education's played out in my family. My father was a big believer in giving back. So all the time growing up, as many of you always hear, get your education, come back home, right? We always hear that. It's something that's kind of embedded in our heads. And it's not quite that easy. But my dad did that. He got his education, he came back home, and he helped build the casino. And so the reason I want to talk about that generational line, because our people didn't just automatically become problem solvers and critical thinkers when they received Western education. Our people were always problem solvers. They were always critical thinkers. They were always planning strategically for the future, because we think for our future generations and not just for ourselves if we think from a traditional mindset. And so the picture I have here is of some of our traditional ways of being, right? So part of my passion in life is returning to traditional food systems. And so part of that has to do with medicines as well. So we have medicines, wild plums, wild grapes. You guys know all those grow at home, right? And Indian corn, drying Indian corn, planting, harvesting. But there was also science even down to our patents, our applique patents. All of this is medicines, and it was displaying certain colors with certain uses. And then of course harvesting ceremony, harvesting buffalo, and then canning, all of this had science to it. It wasn't something we just went out and did. It was something that was done over years. And even our baby births, right, had a science to it. The way the baby's feet are tied, the Maha's feet, the way we walked and left tracks in the ground was because of how our feet were tied before. So all of this was, all those cultural practices had a thought to it. And so I want to say that because I think sometimes we think that in order to become educated in the Western society, we have to leave that alone. And I'm going to argue that you actually use that education in order to save our culture. Because right now we're in a critical time. We're in a critical time where our language is not spoken by very many. We're in a critical time. In your lifetime, you could see that go away. In your lifetime. In your lifetime, you could see, in my lifetime, I'm 42, and I see things way different now than they were when I was younger too. And so you have the power and should feel empowered to be able to use your education in order to build our community and build our nation. So when we define success in school, how many of you want to stay in Macy Wall Hill? How many of you want to work in Macy Wall Hill someday?
Someday.
But right now you don't feel like it's a place where you want to stay?
Due to the supply of jobs? No.
Okay. Does everybody feel like that? I said, do you want to stay in Walt Hill, Macy and work? Is that your goal, is to stay in the community and be able to work and live in the community for your life? Yeah? Okay. That just makes me really sad, right? Because the economy is non-existent. And because there's not an economy, that means that our people are leaving and they're not staying at home. And I'm one of those. I was raised in the city and I haven't moved back. I go back twice, 3 times a week, but I don't live there either, right? So when we define success in school, how would you define being successful in school right now at NACC? How do you define being success or successful?
This is my second year.
It's your second year? So what is success to you?
I haven't made it this far.
So this is your 3rd semester?
Mm-hmm.
How does anyone else define it? In your own terms, how are you successful?
I think that's success.
And it is, right? We think of these ideas of success as like you have to attain something or you have to own something tangible, right? The success can be getting to class when you have 6 babies at home. It can be being able to get to class if you don't have transportation, right? There's all of these things that play into our community and what can make, obstacles in order to be able to do what people call succeed, which might be to graduate within 2 years, 4 years, whatever that idea is. And the reason I asked you that is because I think when we look at a 4-year institution, a lot of times people don't know those struggles that we go through at home in our communities, right? And so when we look at what Native student success is at a 4-year, I think we need to look at the overall experience of our students, right? So we're looking at, is the climate at that institution or the environment at that institution one that supports you as an Indigenous student? Is it one that supports your identity? And identity means that at times you're gonna have to go home for funerals, right? And what does that look like? That means you're gone for 4 days. Does the institution support you when you do that? Does the institution support children being part of your life when you're in school, right? And does it build your relationships with faculty, staff, and other students? Do you have a support network of people who can say, yeah, I know how hard that is, right? At Iowa, I remember students would often come to me and say, my professor is making me give them a obituary because my auntie passed away and they won't dismiss me from class unless I have an obituary. Well, we don't do obituaries a lot of times, right? Because they cost, and sometimes we don't have that additional cost that we can spend. And so what I would do is I would write emails to all the professors, and I would get that weight so that they could go home for 4 days for a funeral. And then I have to explain, so I had to teach. So there's a lot of teaching that goes on. The reason our funerals aren't a week away, we don't do our funerals 2 weeks out, and they are one-day events. They're ceremonies. And so I had to do a lot of teaching to faculty and staff that were not Native, but we developed a system that supported our students eventually. And that's the good thing that came out of it. So again, we're thinking not in terms of what the problem is, right? But how do we solve that problem? And so I want your thoughts to be in terms of that. How do you solve the problems that are there? Because you're going to come upon hardships no matter what you do in life. There's going to be problems. There's going to be obstacles. How do you solve those? And that's what I feel, education, that's what I truly feel, no matter what your degree is in, that's what you should be taught. You should be taught how to critically think and problem solve. So this is going to go into, this is my like, when we talk about our purpose in life, or our passion, my purpose is talking about nation building. And the reason is because it's easy to say everything that's wrong with tribal communities. It's easy to critique them. It's easy to critique individuals. It's a lot harder to think about those solutions. It's a lot harder to think strategically 25 years ahead and what we want for our nation, what we want for our kids, and what we want for our grandkids. And so what nation building is it increases capacity for self-governance. What is self-governance? You guys know? Self-governance means that we are the government of our own communities, right? We govern ourselves. So the BIA doesn't govern us. the US government doesn't govern us, we govern ourselves, okay? And that's really a complicated thing in and of itself. But to do that, we have to have self-determination. What does that mean? What does it sound like it means? Right. It's inherent sovereignty is what it is. It means that I'm inherently sovereign because I'm me. So I'm sovereign and everything I do will be sovereign within my world, right? My capacity. So self-determination means that a community defines its own needs. A community says, these are our priorities. These are our values. This is who we are, right? And that can change over time. Not only can it change, is that we naturally change and adapt as a people, right? So that goes into creating sustainable communities. So what communities need to survive? So this kind of plays into even the program. You need what's called infrastructure, right? You need roads, you need buildings, you need places to shop, to buy your groceries. You need agriculture because you want to eat. You need, what else do you need in the community? Rules, laws, the judicial process. Like those are all things you need to build a community. And so if we don't know how to do that, how can we have a successful community or nation, right? And it's learning how to do that. I don't have all the answers. I don't think any individual person has all the answers. I think it takes a collective group to have all the answers, right? Or to develop the answers. It takes everyone to be a part of that process. So in order, we always hear this word economic development. What is economic development? What do you hear it all the time, right? We're always hearing it. Economic development, we need economic development. What does that mean? Economic development is businesses, and hopefully successful businesses, right? But how do you create successful businesses if we don't have a strong governance system? How do we have successful businesses if we don't have lawyers and judges and a strong judicial process? So when something goes wrong, people can take it to court and there's a fair way of deciding the answers to that, right? So we need lawyers, we need judges, right? But we also need business people, we need architects, we need engineers, we need all of these things to make our community build up into a nation, okay? Any questions? Okay. So, again, when we're talking about how we use Western education to play into building our traditional communities and nations, and I'm telling you this because I want to move home someday, but I want to know that my water is safe to drink. I want to know that the schools are safe for my kids to go to, and that they're getting an Omaha-based education. Granted, I want to know that it's safe. I want to know that I can trust the legal system, the judicial process. I want all of those things in place to move home, to be in that community, right? And so when we talk about, what you're seeing here is a Palm Star map. And how can we use Western education to teach traditional ways of life in our communities? How do they relate? How do they intersect? Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. So we have many creation stories, right? There's many tribes have creation stories. There's many creation stories within tribes. And one of those creation stories talks about how the earth was formed. And I'm gonna, obviously, this is in English and it's very short. But essentially there was stars all around the earth when the earth was covered in water. And those stars imploded, which means they blew up. And the stardust came down and touched water. And that's how life came to be, right? That's one of those stories. What that is I listened to a Mayan man who's a physicist talk about the creation of the world in scientist terms. And what they call the stardust is green matter. Every living thing on Earth has green matter and water. And that ties right back into those creation stories, right? To show how our ancestors were so knowledgeable. So that's science, right? So as a teacher, I'm a teacher in a school. How do I teach the students, my native students, to love themselves? How do I teach them to know that science is not this outside world concept? It's not this Western white concept. But science is something that they're into. We have to be able to do that. In order to do that, we have to research. We have to know, right, what those tribal histories are within our own communities, and then have teachers that can then teach that knowledge to our students. That teaches our students how to love themselves. So they're not going to hate going to school, because when they go to school, they're going to learn about who they are. Right? And that means we need what? Native teachers. And do we have that at home? We have a couple. I know one. Okay. So when we talk about building a nation, we're talking about building capacity. And capacity means the ability to do something, the capacity to do something, right? And so we need, like I said, judges, lawyers, teachers, language instructors. And there's even a science to our language. So you see, the work that Vida Stabler's done within our schools, right? So she had to take our language and she had to learn to apply it to this universal language system so that it can be a written language. So that's why we have it written now, because of the work that she did. And that work that she did, she combined the Western theory of language, right, with the Omaha language research and years of research. She's used her life work to do this, what she's done for our community. And so that's another example of how we can tie those together. We need communication specialists, we need PR specialists, we need historians, we need all of these things to build a community and to build capacity for a nation. So education allows us to build strong communities with intellectual capacity. It can allow teachers to build culture into curriculums, engineers and architects to build housing that can be sustainable and reduce our carbon footprint. We had a gentleman stay with us this summer, so many of you may know Priscilla Parker. She helped with the film Medicine Woman. And she's married to John Wrightford, who's a Osage man. And they stayed with us this summer. And so part of, he's an architect, and part of his vision is to create housing, native housing, that's low cost, easy for people to build, and that reduces the carbon footprint. So he's using those traditional knowledge bases in his architectural work. So that's one example. We need CEOs, because we do need people that know how to manage the business world, right? And we need farmers, not in a traditional Western sense, but people who can grow our corn, our beans, squash, and all that. You guys want to own hot pumpkin? So I grew that this year. A lot of those seeds actually went to the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian keeps all of our traditional seeds. But we're not growing them anymore, right? So how do we reintroduce those foods to our diets, a traditional diet, that can then reduce diabetes and reduce other health concerns, right? So that's all a way that we can use education, use knowledge in order to build our communities. So just from what I said, what are your thoughts on nation building? What have you heard from what I said so far? What do you think nation builders do? Or who do you think nation builders are?
Us.
They are. It is you. Nation builders, so this is like the philosophy of nation building. Sound financial administration, right? Programs that look at the environment and natural resources. So what natural resources do we have in our community? What do you think is a natural resource? Water,
Like if we make gardens or something.
land.
Yeah.
So those are all, and how do we protect and care for those, right? In a culturally competent way. Because they can also be destroyed, right? We can pour chemicals into the land, into the water. We can destroy our the plums and the grapes that I was showing you, right? One of the things we did this year is my daughter is on the dairy fast, and so we went looking for berries. And so we had to know that we learned that how the berries grow, what berries come first. One of the berries, the only berries that's really left is wild raspberries. There's a few strawberries, but predominantly wild raspberries or black raspberries. Have you guys seen those? And so we went picking, and it was a really beautiful experience, but it tied us against the land. What milkweed? Does anybody know milkweed from me? Yeah. So what do you think the science would be behind milkweed soup? Have you made it?
Yeah, it's awesome.
What do you think the science is though? If you think about the process. So when you go picking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're picking the bud in early June because it can't be purple.
Yeah.
So that's a thought that our grandmothers knew, right? And they passed that on. And so then when you're cooking it, what do? You soak it in salt first, but then what do? You boil it. How many times? You boil and dump it 4 times. You know why you do that? It's poisonous. If you were to just boil it 1 time and then eat it, you're going to get sick. And I tried to rush it once and do that, and we got sick. So the science behind it is that our grandmothers knew you boiled and dumped it 4 times because that got rid of the toxins. And then we could eat the milkweed pods, right? So there's all this thought and this science that goes behind things, and there's a reason why we're taught the process, and then when you try and rush it like I did, and I made it right many times, but one time I tried to rush it, and sure enough, there was a reason behind that, right? So one of the things that nation builders do that I think is the most important is that they develop reservation economies, and economies can be based in traditional economies. So traditionally, what do you think our economies were based on? How did we get products? How did we get things? You know this.
The men and the women just had their own jobs. They always went out to go get like their meats and like the hunting aspect of it. And women were always like picking our vegetables, taking care of being at home, taking care of stuff.
And how do we relate to other groups? We were trading all the time. You know, I didn't wear them today, but like our dime earrings that we wear, Canadian dime earrings, how do you think we got Canadian dimes? We were trading buffalo hides all the way up to Winnipeg. So that was an economy, right? And we were trading and we were bringing something back. Whether it be wild rice on the way, it could be different animals that they hunt up there, like otter. But we were bringing something back. That's a trade-based economy, and that's what we were doing. We were doing all of those things. We were trading corn. And one of the most beautiful stories I heard from I have the Squawky sisters lived in Iowa City a long time, and I actually learned how to process Indian corn with the Squawky bear clan. But one of the beautiful stories I heard was how they were able to purchase the land that they live on. The women had such a surplus of Indian corn that they were able to sell that to the railroads that were coming through. And when they sold it to the railroads, they earned so much money that they were then able to buy the land that they live on. So the women's economy is what purchased that land, the women's trade, right? So that also is an economic tool. So I don't want us to always think of like these businesses that are like completely Eurocentric. We can also have economies that are more rooted in our traditional practices. So this is my own personal quote. I didn't quote anyone, that's why it's not cited. But we have lots of problems in Indian country, right? And everybody likes to talk about the problems. But I want to talk about how we build human capacity and critically think to solve those problems in a culturally appropriate manner to each community. And so that is how, to me, when you're looking at going to get an education and you're looking at what you can learn here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln or USD or the University of Iowa, wherever you go to school, what you can learn there and then bring back to your community. And that doesn't always mean that you have to go back to the reservation. I live in the city, and we were tanning elk hides right outside of our house in Sioux City. So it doesn't, wherever you are is where your community and your culture is. It doesn't always have to be at home, but I still call our reservation home. And that will always be my home. And I have family and loved ones that live there. And that's the community that I'm always going to be concerned about. That's the nation that I'm always going to be invested in, first and primary, right? No matter where I'm at. And so that's what I wanted to communicate to you all, is to start thinking about how your knowledge that you're getting can go back and not just help your people, but help us build a nation, build a